Hi guys, welcome back. It's a boiling hot Wednesday afternoon on the south coast of the UK today, and I'm coming in to get some respite from the sun. I've spent the morning going over some of my vocab on Memorise out on the garden seat. Thank you to everyone who's watched my recent video on Memorise Premium so far. But yeah, I've come into the shade to do a video. And what I wanted to talk about today, basically, was something that I felt there's not so many videos out there on YouTube about, which is employment opportunities for people, for Japanese graduates like myself. There are lots of YouTube videos out there on studying Japanese, on going to university, on teaching in Japan. But not so many, I don't feel, on what choices there are for people who want to study Japanese, but don't want to go into teaching afterwards. You know, there's a lot on the JET program and things like that, but very little outside of that, at least in my experience. So basically, you know, Japanese studies graduates have a few different options as far as I see it. Bear in mind that the suggestions and the options that I'm going to talk about will generally come from my own experiences and the experiences of the Japanese graduates that I've met whilst studying Japanese or being in Japan. So, you know, this is by no means a comprehensive list, but I just like to try and give some people out there a few different ideas about what they could potentially do after they've been to university to study Japanese. The big one, of course, as I mentioned before, is going to teach English in Japan. That's what a lot of my cohort from my year group at university have gone on to do. Mostly with JET, although there are other options such as intheinaka and other private language schools going to eikaiwas and things. And it is certainly, it's a good way to get into Japan. It's a good way to get a foothold in the country. You can't call it a career in and of itself because JET, being the main one, offers only up to 5 years. In Japan, you can do 1, 2, 3, 5, however many years you want on your contract, but only up to a maximum of 5 years. So you can't say that it's a career in and of itself. And of course, a lot of people will want to move to Japan, put down roots in Japan. That'll be a big part of why they've studied the language. Other people won't necessarily want to teach, but there are merits to going abroad and teaching English, even if you don't necessarily want to do that long term. A lot of people go on and work in eikaiwas or set up their own language schools, and that's a great way to progress from the shorter term programs such as JET. But there are also merits to doing these things even if it's not what you want to do long term. You know, I certainly think you should have a certain degree of passion for teaching and enjoy that work environment if you are going to apply to do JET. Or to go and teach English in Japan. I do know too many people who really just use it as an excuse to get back to Japan and don't really have any interest in teaching, and I really don't think that's the right way to go about it, because you're really sort of letting down the school and the children that we put with. But most people, I find, even those who are a little bit worried about it, tend to find that they actually quite enjoy teaching when they get out there. But it can be a good way of really establishing yourself in the country and putting yourself out there for other jobs in Japan once your time teaching has come to an end. And I know people who've done that. It just makes sense. If you're in the country, it makes it easier to apply for jobs and go for interviews and things in that country. So yeah, there are definitely plenty of advantages to going and teaching Japan as a way to get into the country in the first place. But there are other options. Personally, when I graduated, a few months after I graduated, my first proper job was working for a translation company. I was based just outside Oxford, and I worked for a company that translated pharmaceutical documents, mostly translations from within the medical industry, usually to be used in medical research or medical trials, patient questionnaires, things like that. And in my office of, it must have been, it was a small company, there was probably 9 or 10 of us in the office, and I would say 6 or 7 had language degrees. I had Japanese degree, a couple of the girls had French degrees, someone spoke Spanish, we had Italian. So that's a good example of another option out there for people who don't necessarily want to dive straight back into Japan, or don't want to invest the time and money in a master's, or getting their translation qualifications and actually translating themselves. I wasn't translating myself. I worked as a project manager. We would get these documents. We would organise native speakers, qualified translators to forward and back translate these things. We would basically oversee the translation from finish to end. So it was interesting. You get a lot of responsibility. You really get to see a project come together, and this sort of a real sense of accomplishment when you get a project from beginning to end. And I really felt like I was making use of my degree, because you had to understand the nuances of languages and really have a feel for whether a translation was correct and whether it really captured the essence of the original text. So it was a good way of putting my degree into use without having to take it beyond and gain the extra qualifications needed to be a proper translator. I got a decent graduate salary for that job, and that I think is a really good direction for people to go in if you don't necessarily want to emigrate, but you still want to make use of your degree. Personally, I ended up leaving. I didn't enjoy the office environment, the office dynamic. I got really bad headaches at first from working under artificial lighting, and I really didn't enjoy being stuck in front of a computer for 9 hours a day. So it didn't work out for me, but I definitely think it's a really good option for certain people with language degrees. So that's one example, sort of going into the translation industry but not necessarily as a translator. Then there is, of course, going into the translation industry as a translator. There are a few different ways of doing that. A lot of people go on and do their masters in translation studies. They go and get specific translation qualifications. That obviously requires time and money, but it's a good way of doing it. I've known people who have gone into translation companies as proofreaders, done more sort of run-of-the-mill repetitive jobs and worked their way up, sort of made contacts, just made their language ability known, and worked their way up to work as proper translators. That's a more difficult way to do it, because as a translator, quite often you need to have specialist vocabulary that you won't have picked up during your degree. People will go and specialise in medical translations or legal translations or engineering translations, things like that, and that usually requires further study and proper certification. But I do know people who have gone on and worked successfully as translators for companies or as freelancers without having picked up any further qualifications. So that's certainly something that can be done. And of course there is that choice as well to be made if you do go into translation, whether you want to work for a company or whether you want to freelance. That the freelancing as a translator is certainly a very attractive option for a lot of people who do this degree, because it really allows you some freedom. You get to be your own boss to a certain extent. You can create your own working day and timetable. Obviously you'll always have deadlines for your projects and things like that, but you can choose, you know when you work best, and you can adjust your day accordingly. You know, I know I have a good friend who's a freelance translator, and he's got a young family, and being freelance really helps him, you know, if he needs to take a few days off to you know, for whatever reason, for something to do with his family, help him, this and that, he can do. He's recently gone over to Japan for an extended period of time, for I think a couple of months, with his family, and he's able to do that without any worries, because he can just take his laptop with him, and he's fine. So that's a big advantage to being a translator, to being a freelance translator, of course. So that's another option, one I'm sure a lot of people will have thought about. There's interpreting, but that of course requires much more time, much more effort to really break into, because it's an incredibly specialised and difficult job to do. On the spot interpretation is hugely difficult, but the money in it is much better than most other jobs you'll get from most of your standard jobs from a language degree. You know, if you end up working for multinational companies or international organisations like the UN, then you can earn really impressive money, but you know, it takes years and years and years of dedication to really break into that. There's always the option of going and working for companies that might need specialists in certain countries and languages. You know, I've known people who have gone and worked for multinational organisations in advertising, in PR, who travel around the world, who find themselves based in Japan a lot of the time, and sort of sell their company abroad, which is, I imagine, a very interesting job for people who are sort of that way inclined. So yeah, guys, those are just a few ideas, a few experience that I know of. But what I'd really love is for you guys to sort of leave in the comments below your own experiences. Those of you out there watching that are Japanese studies graduates, what have you gone on to do? What options are there? What experiences have you had? Yeah, leave a comment below, or make a video. It's something I feel that we could definitely do with more information out there about, for people who are thinking about studying Japanese. Something that I would have loved to have had more information on when I was at university. Yeah, I really could have, I think it would be helpful for people to know what the options are out there for them when they graduate. So thanks for watching. Hope some of the information was interesting, and I hope it just sort of spurs you to go and look and see what the options are out there for you. Catch you in the next video, guys.